My background was one where I had a very warm family, and we were very secure in many ways other than financially. And we lived in an area of Glasgow which is known for its deprivation. And just about my teenage years, there were a number of problems cropping up for my parents and also for our neighbours regarding the condition of their houses, roofs, old Victorian houses with roofs which were leaking and windows which were rotting. And my mother was aware that there was grants which were available. So I was then asked, because I was a precocious 14-year-old, to complete all of these, as a result of which these grants were achieved for the family, and we had a new roof and we had new windows put in, and I found that filling in forms was actually quite effective in problem solving. So I arrived at the Sheriff Court in Glasgow, which is the equivalent of the Crown Court, and was shown into the witness room. And when I was taken into the witness room, it was by a pretty gruff individual, placed there with no information. It was smoke-filled at that time as well. It was really unpleasant, and left there without any indication as to what was going to happen or what I was likely to anticipate. Then I was called out by name. And as I did so, I had to run the gauntlet of the friends of the individual who was accused, who were standing in the foyer staring. And then, to take the oath, with your hand shaking, as you were, giving your evidence, and your knees knocking. And then nobody seemed to be terribly interested. In a sense, you felt very passive and quite used. You were there for a function, but there wasn't very much in the way of emotional intelligence in the way in which the system was treating you. You had to go where you were sent. You were a junior prosecutor, and I was sent to after 2 years in Edinburgh, which was fabulous, I was sent then to Airdrie, working with some very senior prosecutors on cases ranging from the investigation of murders, rapes, burglaries, fraud, breaches of the peace, assault, and so there was a range of crime which was very interesting. And one area which I became interested in at an early stage was also child abuse. And at that stage, the notion of grooming hadn't entered prosecutorial vocabulary. There was no training available at that stage. The Americans were training, but not in Scotland nor in England in the legal context. It's a profoundly complex area of criminality and requires real skills to be able to understand, as well as about cognitive development of children and language, as well as the environment. So all of these features were completely misunderstood at that stage. Because I was interested, I was put on a working group on children, and from that I was then sent off to America to train with district attorneys for a week's intensive course out in the desert. I can remember it, and it was like the scales falling off your eyes. They knew a great deal more about it in their system and their practices. So we came back and we devised better ways of dealing with it. But again, this was just the prosecution. You had to influence the police, you also had to influence the judiciary and also the politicians to do things which at that time were very radical, about children not necessarily having to be in a courtroom to give evidence, which now is seen as perfectly normal that children, if they give evidence at all, will give evidence on CCTV camera remotely. In Scotland, the prosecutor meets with the victims, you interview the victims, it's much closer. And also the role of the procurator fiscal, as it's known in Scotland, is also the coroner. So we investigate sudden deaths and major incidents. And in addition to that, you had opportunities to go into the appeals unit, where you'd be looking at the law and how it's developing, which was much more sort of challenging intellectually in many respects. And then the policy group, which was developing prosecution policy, looking at incoming legislation that was developing as well. So as a career, it wasn't a narrow career, it was very wide in many respects. It was working with wonderful people and diverse, because we had the oil and gas industry up there, we had a nuclear power station, and we had the largest gas exchange from all the North Sea gas on land. So there were all sorts of issues about terrorism, security. We had Balmoral up there, so there were issues which were quite different from what I'd experienced in the central of Scotland, and different people and a different culture altogether. Because I was piloting some projects up there for a victim support initiative, which was later rolled out across the country, but it was about giving support and information to victims, not something which is seen as by any means radical now. So I established a sort of separate agency within the service to provide support and guidance to victims. There were significant ructions at that point in the legal establishment because I'd come as a solicitor. That background that I've described to you wasn't terribly well known out with the prosecution service as to the broad nature of the responsibilities. And therefore, particularly, it would normally be someone senior from the bar and usually someone political, attached to a political party. So this was the first non-political woman in 500 years, and also not coming from the right part of the legal establishment in many respects. So there were many people deeply suspicious of me at the beginning. And so I set about doing that at the same time as balancing the family. I had the great fortune to have married a hairdresser, not that you would see it from today, he's abandoned me now, but no, not abandoned me, he's abandoned my hair, he's still with me. But he, so he very promptly said that he would be happy to give up his salons to look after our children. So he did that. So it was almost like the reverse of a 1950s marriage. So my husband did that, looked after our children when I was in Edinburgh. But I did have an elderly mother who also came to live with us at that stage in her late 80s. So we had an interesting household, but which most people would not have recognised when I emerged looking quite composed from the door. The judges were always delightful towards me. There was never any difficulty in the courts at all. And senior QCs were always, but there was still an undercurrent of resentment from the more junior members of the bar who saw this prize post having been snatched by someone who was not, in their eyes, certainly worthy of that, because, and therefore there was a great deal of having to prove yourself during that stage. And this was a nationalist party wanting to do as much as it could, whereas in fact my job was to ensure that they did not trespass beyond the devolved competence of that Parliament into areas which would be reserved to Westminster. So we were exploring the limits of and the nature of the legislation which brought us to the Supreme Court, through the appeal court to the Supreme Court, which was hugely interesting, and just as a lawyer, just a huge treat to be involved in those debates with some brilliant lawyers, both in the civil service but also in the English or the UK civil service in London, and the law officers there. It was, as I say, at times you would pinch yourself when you were engaged in debates with these people about these matters. "11 years is a very long time as a law officer, and also I quite frankly thought, you know, in terms of your achievement, at one point you're going to go down the other side and people get fed up hearing your voice or seeing you, and it was inevitable as well. So I thought I need to go at some point, but I wanted to do something quite different. I didn't want to become a judge. I might not be able to become a judge, I might not have selected me, but nonetheless that wasn't an ambition. And I was very quickly asked to chair a commission on women offenders, which I carried out over the following year while I was working as a QC as well. And that reported on the conditions of women in prison, but also about the efficacy of imprisoning so many women, with recommendations of diverting women away from prison and away from prosecution. I also carried out an inquiry for the Home Secretary on deaths in custody, and to look at the causes and the difficulties surrounding not just the police but also the coroner system and the inquest system, and the absence of legal representation for the next of kin of families was a significant aspect of that. I wanted to work out with Scotland because I'd lived in Scotland and worked, so I thought it would be great opportunities. So I had been headhunted by the United Nations about the prosecutor to the International Criminal Court, but that would have been more prosecution. I was then headhunted for Oxford University while I was acting as a QC in an inquiry, which I was thoroughly enjoying, again, not having the responsibilities of the office, but really enjoying that practice. And it just seemed a very off-the-wall proposition, but an interesting one, and I was enticed to go down and to have a visit, and just loved it, and loved the notion of being in an area where it was completely different competence that was required, working with young people and academics and being able to listen and learn to what was happening in a number of diverse areas out with the law. I would be concerned that people would think that to have a satisfying life in law that you have to somehow, scale the mountain of senior posts. I think that law is just such a hugely interesting career. Whatever branch you go into, it's hard, but it's fascinating.